Hi, it's Jeff Shire from Mattress To Go, and today I want to talk to you a little bit more about inner springs. In a previous video we talked about the basic inner spring designs that are out there, and in this video I wanted to get into a little bit more detail on the differences between the inner spring units and things that you can use to compare one style of inner spring unit to another. The first thing let's talk about is spring count. That's usually what's brought up, or sometimes it's less correctly called a coil count, but the words are usually used interchangeably. We're talking about the number of individual springs within that unit. Usually when you're given a number for a spring count, it's for the full size. That's sort of the way it's done in the industry. But you want to get the number of individual springs for the size you're looking at. Now when you're getting the spring count for the mattress you're looking at, make sure it's the actual number of springs on the inside. One thing that's happening these days is many of the mattress models are foam encased around the perimeter to give you a little bit of extra reinforcement, and they'll give you a number of what they call the coil density, which is the number of springs. If we didn't have edge support, how many springs would be in that mattress? It's a bit of a way to sort of inflate the number of springs in the unit. You want to know the actual number of springs in that mattress you're looking at with the edge encasement system. So just realize that you may get two different numbers for the same mattress. While we're talking about edge support units, that's something that you're typically finding on your better adult support items. There's a few different types out there. This demo shows one of the more popular foam edge encasement systems. Basically, the inner spring unit sits in a tub of high-density polyurethane foam all the way around the sides and on the bottom. And the reason that we use edge support system in mattresses is not so much for sitting on the edge of the bed, although it does make it a little nicer. It's really to increase the amount of usable sleep surface on the bed. You can sleep closer to the edge and there's less roll-off on the product, and that's really the advantage of having an edge support system. Now the polyurethane foam encasement system is really nice. Another common type of edge support system is a metal clip unit that you'll find placed between the border rod around the perimeter of the item. Also, there's different pieces of extruded polyethylene foam that some brands, they may drop them. It's like a tube piece into, every 7th or 8th inner spring unit, or even a extruded polyethylene piece that fits all the way around the perimeter. Every manufacturer has their own take on this. So there's different systems that are out there. One thing to talk about, besides the edge support system and the number of springs when you're looking at inner spring units, in addition to that, is the gauge of wire or the thickness of wire. Generally speaking, the thickness of springs you'll run from 12.5 gauge up to about 18 gauge. The higher the number, the thinner the steel. I know that's a little counterintuitive, but that's how it works. For example, a 16 gauge spring unit is about 6/100ths of an inch thick, whereas a 13 gauge steel inner spring unit is 9/100ths of an inch thick. Now that may not sound like too much of a difference, but going from 16 to 13 gauge, that's a 50% increase in the thickness of steel. So it really does make a big difference in support. So not only with the spring count edge support, you'll also want to know the gauge or the thickness of steel in the inner spring unit. Now one thing that they do to help keep the springs from sagging over time is they temper the springs. And you may have heard of this before. Tempering is treating the steel so that it retains its shape. And you can do this chemically, electrically, thermally, by heat. Usually it's done by heat. And the thing that you'll hear about in the mattress industry is this is a twice tempered inner spring unit. And usually what that means is when the steel is in its straight form, it's usually treated once to keep its shape. And then when it's wound into the actual shape of the spring, it's treated again, usually by heat, heated and then allowed to cool to keep its shape. Some of the inner spring units that are out there, for example, the Marshall coil that we talked about before, the spring and the sock, these are usually treated only once. Usually it's when the metal is in its rolled form, then it's woven into the spring unit and put into the fabric at the same time. So once it's in the sock, we can't treat it and make it harder. Simmons, who uses what they call the pocketed coil inner spring unit, they actually treat the steel with, I believe it's magnesium, to make it a little harder, but it's only a single tempered steel. There's only one company I know of that treats a Marshall coil spring when it's in the shape of the spring before it's put in the sock, and that's called Six Springs out of Great Britain. Very, very expensive beds. They start around $3,000 and go up from there. But you do want to make sure that the springs are tempered. A good twice tempered steel spring unit will generally retain about 98% of its height over the life of the bed, over a 10-year expected comfort life. So a very important thing to look at. So we have spring count, we have edge support systems, we have gauge of steel, and we have tempering. So let me put this all into perspective for you a little bit. The Bonnell innerspring units that we talked about before, the old hourglass shaped springs, these will tend to be found more in the traditional promotional type beds, something for kids for guest bedrooms or for less frequent adult use. A popular gauge of steel will be 13.5 gauge steel. Some of the thicker ones will go to 13 gauge, a little bit better. Usually have a nice thick border rod around the edge. It's usually about a 6 gauge steel, nice and thick there. Most of these won't have an edge support system. If they do, it's usually the spring clip design. More of a basic unit right here. Popular spring counts in a full size, 312, 336. Sometimes you'll even find a 364 out there. Again, a little higher, a little bit of a better unit. If we go with the popular LFK open-ended sensory arm springs, these will vary quite a bit. With a smaller spring, you'll have a higher spring count in a full size, 600, 620, 660 are popular numbers. But the gauge of steel will be thinner. More springs, we can't make these out of a real thick steel because it'll be like sleeping on the floor, and you can do that for free. So why bother? 14.5 gauge steel are popular numbers for a higher spring count like this. Now if you go with an open-ended sensory arm innerspring unit with a larger spring design, like this is a newer version called the Verticoil from Leggett & Platt, you can find these at 13 or 13.5 gauge steel. But in a queen size, we're going to have 460 springs. Lower spring count, bigger spring, thicker steel. So you can see how these things sort of play together when you're looking at different products out there. Some of these will come with a foam edge encasement system, some won't. Again, we get back to the Marshall coil, or again, the spring in a sock or the pocketed coil. You'll find quite a few differences in the thickness of steel here. Some of the thicker ones will be 13.75, but these will actually go up to 18 gauge steel, very thin. A common thing that you'll find is around the perimeter of the product, instead of a foam edge encasement system, they may make a row of springs of a thicker gauge steel, maybe like a 13.75, and then the interior springs will be thinner, like a 15 gauge steel, for a softer feel, but a little bit of a firmness around the edge. And they may even combine that with an extra foam encasement unit on the side. Again, depends upon the manufacturer, the amount of money you're willing to spend, and what they're trying to achieve with the product. Now the next innerspring unit is the continuous coil innerspring unit. And a typical thickness gauge of steel for this would be 13, 13.5, 14 gauge steel. Spring counts for this unit will, for a queen size, generally be in the upper 600 range, right around there. This unit is unique in that it's pretty easy to zone this innerspring unit in the middle third of the bed, running side to side in the mattress. You can place the springs a little closer together and to give more support where most of your weight's at. That's something that's commonly done. And these come both with a border rod around the perimeter, and then sometimes they are foam encased. And then we have the one that I've been using for a demo here, the double offset knotted spring unit. This is actually a pretty basic design, but these tend to be very heavy duty. This particular one is 12.5 gauge steel, very thick. Again, a spring count can be 460 for a queen size in this. And so you're thinking, well, it's not a very high spring count. We have some beds that go up to 800 in a spring count. But I will tell you that in the industry, this is probably one of the biggest beasts as far as giving you very firm support and still contouring to your body. You go with 12.5 gauge steel, twice tempered double offset innerspring unit, you can park a truck on this thing, it's not going to break down. Your foams are going to wear out before the innerspring unit wears out. So one other thing just to mention, to go back to the Marshall coil and spring counts really quickly, sometimes you'll find a bed with a 2,000 spring count in a queen size. And you're thinking, wow, the springs must be the size of springs in a pen or something like that. And what they're doing is you'll have an innerspring unit within the mattress, and then they may have a topper on top with a small microcoil version of this. And then basically it's springs on top of springs, and they're just doubling the number to make, they're trying to achieve a feel, but also to inflate the spring count a little bit. So realize that you're not going to have 2,000 of these inside a queen size mattress. You just couldn't do it. Is there really a best spring unit out there? That's a bit of a subjective experience, and that's based upon what you're looking for in the mattress. We certainly, in 20 years of doing this, have our own opinion, There are certain inner spring units we will not carry that we've done in the past, and just through objective research we're not going to offer those to the public. We get too many issues with them. There are certain ones that we favor, but you know what? Come into the store and we'll be happy to give you our opinions on those products and why we do and don't carry certain types. That's not what we're looking to do here in the video. We just want to give you some good objective information.